Top of the middle of the day to you, boys and girls. We're at the bench in the shop for another little narrative session. Could even be considered somewhat of an infomercial. Gonna throw the disclaimers out in the beginning. Long and tedious if you're not a knuckle/gearhead like myself. If you are that type, you might find it interesting and hopefully enjoyable, maybe even enlightening. If the other disclaimer is going to be that the teleprompter is down for the count. I'm going to try to regurgitate a lot of information in a pretty short period of time from my pea-sized cranium. Please forgive me for if and when I slur and or stammer my speech through this process. So as we begin, a couple of big kid 1 series Stihl saws. We have a 461. We actually have two 461s on the left, my personal 661 on the right. As a side note, this particular saw is going to be for sale. I know they respond well to an insanitization process. I'm going to be looking at how to extract a little bit more power out of these saws. This saw will be available for sale. Probably won't be for another, I don't know, sometime in July. I think it's probably going to be done at that point. Just as a side note, this is Mr. King Cord saw, headed back to New York when we get it wrapped up. The saw on the far left is headed down in the Sierras. Those guys really seem to like those. Both of these saws are going to get their combustion chambers modified and the enhanced flow tricks that I do. You want to pull a 3-foot bar with authority. That's kind of the way you want to work these saws over. In addition to the insanitization process, gives them quite a bit more low-end grunt to pull the long bars. But we kind of segued off there. If we talk about displacement, the 461s come in the same as the 460 046, 76.5 essentially cc's. The 661 comes in at 91. They're down 3 millimeters on the length of the stroke from the 660, but they're up 2 millimeters in bore size to 56. The 660 and 066 had a 54 millimeter bore, so when they redesigned this saw, they shortened the stroke by 3 millimeters, but increased the bore by 2 millimeters. That equals the same amount of cc's. Just an interesting side note. Outwardly, when they're assembled on the bench, they look relatively close to the same. You'd expect that from the same manufacturer. They're both the 1 series big kid saws, I call them. So there's not a lot of difference that we're going to discuss there. If you do look at the handlebars, however, there is an interesting point with that. As with the 046 and the 460, these particular handlebars have a nice forward slant, so your wrist is fairly relaxed. The only thing I don't particularly care for is what I call the swoop-de-doo here. It comes almost straight off of the top part of the handlebar where you spend most of your time hanging on to these. It's pretty short, and it's actually the distance between the handle and the pistol grip is a relatively short distance, and that puts kind of a lot of pressure on the bar. The bar has more leverage. You have less leverage essentially. The Husky and the Dolmar, for example, in a previous video we talked about how they're a little bit further apart and the leverage is better when you're running a little bit longer bar, but that's my personal preference. 4 screws come out, the things fall out. It's pretty awesome. If you look at the 661, we're seeing that we're dealing with a spring mount situation, and I need to locate the other part. Here we go. This is what it looks like now. The 660 was 4 bolts and it falls off. This system here is over-engineered in my humble opinion and requires a lot of monkey business to get it apart. You have to dismantle a lot of things and loosen stuff up. I don't know why it has to be so impressive. I know Husky's been using spring mounts for years. 5 bolts, the handlebars fall off in your hand. This hooks onto the cylinder. We'll be looking at that in a little bit later in the video. This piece bolts underneath the cases. If we take on the tank, if we take a look underneath there, we can see the screw comes in up underneath there. This part is kind of, you got to pry it out of there, and the handlebars fit right here. It's probably a little bit stronger system than the other one. With the tank situation, I don't think it's stronger with the spring mount though. I think the spring's weaker than the rubber annulars, but that's my personal opinion, albeit humble as it is. Anyway, So I'm not even sure where to start. We have so much information to cover. Cartridge style air cleaners, they're same concept, a little bit different design. We'll look at the carb box cover in a second, but same kind of cartridge style on these stock. Interesting to note that now you can actually get a max flow style air cleaner system, foam filter element that's oiled, which is nice, standard cage, but the different colored plastic backing plate right there is all same basic concept. It's just a little bit different shape to work on the new saw, and it's got a different die, but it's a good system. Works much better in fine particulates, especially if you're working in any kind of a burn situation. Far superior system. If we look at the carb box cover, which is this part, it's similar in design to all of them, just works with this saw in particular. We have this piece here which works with the air filter, which I'm thinking that it's to keep the pulse circuit separate. I'm not sure why that's there for any other reason. The filter fits, seals on the rubber lip, clear up on the back. There's a lot of talk about how these are failing prematurely. I think the plastic on plastic coupled with the vibrations causing them to wear a little bit. This saw is going to get an upgrade. We're actually going to use the screw-on version and a different flange system than what's going on here. It'll be a lot more open as well, allowing for a little bit different flow, but that's just a side note. If we look at the carb box cover for the 461, relatively close to the 460, 46, same flange, been around for eons. They redesigned the 056 Magnum 2 into the 64. These are same basic platform. That saw came out, I think, you could buy them in 1984, I believe, is when you could first buy them. It could have been late in 83, somewhere around that time frame. So the same basic design for eons. If we look underneath at the carburetor themselves, 17 millimeter Venturi, stops on the needles. We're going to unstopper the stops so we can do something, actually tell what's going on. Same basic concept and shape. They're both Walbros. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. We do have a servo that electronically controls the fuel metering based off the speed of the crank. But same shape and same way they hook up on the tank. Same concept as what was the 660 style. If we look at these are called intake manifolds, at least to me they are. We can see that they have these rough ridges in there. It's pretty standard for the Stihls to be made that way. Big open hole though, however, changes a little bit where it mates up with the flange on the back of the cylinder, but not too bad. This is actually oblong shaped on the 661. I'm not sure why they do that. The 660 is pretty much the same. It's actually a little taller. It's about the same as the 461, but it's actually more narrow here, which I thought was interesting. But we do have a big open hole going onto the cylinder. They match up well with the flange. Don't ever seem to have too much problems. Generally, I think this might be a situation where they're trying to atomize the fuel, I think, is what's going on with the air. I always thought the atomization process was happening when the piston's going up and trying to compress the charge. You get a lot of movement with the air. That's called turbulence, and that's where the atomization process happens. I always thought that's where we were trying to get atomization, not so much here. In a race application, you don't see roughing up the intake manifold on anything. In any kind of a performance application, you're not trying to rough it up. Now maybe this is helping diffuse the back pressure, the blowback, when the piston's going down before the port gets closed. That'd be the intake port, but I'm not sure. That's just my thought. If we look at the cylinder on the 461, we see that it's got a pretty small combustion chamber relative for nowadays, especially compared to the Husqvarna's, but it's got, you can see, pretty good opening, but we're trying to change the shape from kind of almost round to completely oblong in a really short distance. I'm not a fan of that right there, folks. That's not a performance enhancing situation in my humble opinion. If we look at the transfer ports, And if we look at the transfer ports, we see they're pretty decent size for the bore size we have. They're not flat though. They actually, if you have the cylinder on the cases like this, they actually come up, but basically toward the cases more so. They're shaped, they're not flat across there. They don't have an arc to them like the 660 did. They're actually inverted this way. It's to help keep the exhaust from getting too much of the hydrocarbons. It's actually trying to keep the charge from getting out quite as fast, I think, so you don't end up with a bunch of unburned charge getting out in the exhaust and having a hydrocarbon issue. Pretty wide exhaust port, as you see. Kind of interesting. It's really wide across the front of the piston, which is nice. You're going to evacuate the gases pretty quickly. It's relatively small though. If we look at the 661, for example, we'll notice that the intake is pretty much round, pretty oval shape, but more so round than oblong, so you're not trying to completely change the flow as it's going through a pretty short distance, which is sweet. Pretty decent transfer ports again, same basic concept. They are inverted this way. Again, we're trying to keep a lot of the unburned charge from getting out the exhaust. Pretty wide, similar. In concept, they're like carbon copies except for the intake. Pretty wide exhaust port there. One thing we'll look at real quick though is the gasket. The gasket for the 461, I don't know if you can see that. It's actually it's wider on the 461. Even the bolt hole pattern's wider. I'm hoping you can see this with the aid of my light, because I think the lighting in my shop isn't the greatest for what we look at sometimes. But anyway, they're the same basic shape, but the 661, which is on the left, is actually smaller port size, and it is a lot more cc's. So I thought that was an interesting situation. As a side note, everybody recognizes this name. I'm not sure if we recognize this name right here. It's Italian. I'm not going to attempt to butcher it. I first noticed this on a cylinder in about 1986. This company obviously has been making OEM cylinders. Again, a name we recognize. Again, the same name that we don't necessarily recognize and maybe can't even pronounce. Interesting. This company's been making OEM top ends for 30 years at least that I know of. As another interesting side note, these were having problems when they were testing them in Australia, overheating. If you look at what's going on with the top three main big fins, the mount comes off the handlebar, attaches right here. We got carte blanche on a cylinder design, and we cut a whole bunch of the surface area out on the three main fins that come off the top of the cylinder head, which is where all the temperature, where it's the greatest anyway. I thought that was an odd choice. If you have carte blanche, why would you do something like that? If we compare the transfer ports real quick, again, you can see the 461, that's how they look stock. I am wondering why it's not consistent. At least in the 661, we're consistent. The combustion chamber is quite a bit bigger in the 661 than in the 660. I will make that note, though. But they're pretty, I mean, I don't know, pretty small. I guess I was not super pleased when I saw what I saw the first time. Wrist pin bearings, we have same basic designs, been around since the 660, same size, just a different color. They were gold, the cage part. 100 thousandths are the diameter of the needles. 60 thousandths are the diameters on the needles for the 461. If we look at the piston for the 661, we can see it's run a little bit at the factory, but not too much. They have an associated situation here. Every one I've ever seen has the same. One thing we'll note, skirt smaller in the back than in the front. I've asked if it's to deal with the heat, and then I thought maybe it might be to help combat against the centripetal force that's happening as the rod rolls up from the back and is rolling around toward the front. You might get a little bit more pressure going that way. Maybe that's why they have the skirt wider in the front. So I haven't gotten a response yet, but I did ask that question. 2 millimeter bigger bore than 056, same basic design, except they put one wrist pin in the front and one in the back instead of like they normally do in the back of a 660. They're just opposite the skirt on the back. 461 has an interesting little design. Divot, if you want to call it, little recess right here, so when it's at bottom dead center, it's not actually impeding the flow that comes up through the front of the transfer ports right there. Skirt's relatively close to the same length. It's just a little bit taller in the back. They also have a wear issue that's associated with them. Every one of them I've ever seen, same situation. One of the things I did with my bore gauge was I mic'd this cylinder and the other one actually 6 ways to Sunday. There's not a lot of variance, but the back of it's a little bit wavy, pretty good, consistent from below the exhaust, or excuse me, intake port to the bottom, but it actually gets a little bit different. That cylinder's 4 10,000ths to 2 10,000ths depending on where you measure it. They both taper as they go down in the bore, but the back, both of the back of the cylinders are a little bit wavy. I did check the chamfering out. It feels pretty good. You can't see anything, you don't feel anything. We have associated wear issue, not a lot of time. It's on every one of them. One thing I got to segue off on and talk about what the piston's actually doing. If we think about it in concept, it's transferring the energy from the combustion process to the rod. It's acting as a cam and the valves in like a 4-cycle engine. It's opening and closing the ports, and also it's acting as a heat sink. So there's 3 functions, main functions that the piston's trying to accomplish. And we have way offset ring pins again. This would be in the back, this would be up in the front. Kind of a bummer that they do it that way now, but that's the way it is. If we look at the exhaust for a second, small hole. This is a used exhaust off of another saw. Pretty small hole. A little bit of a diffuser in there, but it's a lot better than what we see on the 460 version. And again, I think we're trying to keep a lot of the exhaust, the unburnt charge getting into the exhaust and then becoming a problem with the atmosphere. You can see pretty choked down on the ports. That's the way it goes. Another interesting side note, they come out like this a lot. They look like they've been kind of sitting in a C area, or an area that has a lot of vapor, salt air. Had to check my time real quick. Sorry about that. I think we kind of rattled a lot of stuff out of here. Just a lot of interesting information to me anyway. I find it fascinating to take what's been given to you and figure out a way to make it run. I think we didn't look at the cases yet, so we'll take a look in here real quick. You can see the cast aluminum piece right here, and what's going on is the piston actually straddles that. And what is happening with that is we're trying to direct the flow from under the dome to the front of the cases where the cavity is, because that's where the transfer ports start. They sit right on top of the cases, and the transfer ports are located in the front now. If you look at the recesses right here, however, it's important to note the old style cases look like this, where they had the cavity on the sides. The loops went around a very short distance. The first series 461 saws actually had both styles of ports. They had the long tubes like they have now, and they had this other style that came in around from the side. Those saws actually ran better. They were getting a lot more air flow, which, I mean, if you think about it in concept, that makes sense. If we take a look at the 661 cases real quick, we'll see that it's the same exact situation, just a little bit different shape. However, there's no recesses that are designed and manufactured in the cases, which are molded at this point now, or they have been, I mean, but they're being CNC machined. A lot of the surfaces, it seems like they're being done independently. It seems like they used to be done years ago. They were done as one unit, then they were split. But it's the same concept with the 661. The skirt straddles. This little flange made of aluminum, trying to direct the flow from underneath the dome, stuffing it through the front. But the cases are well thought out and designed to work well with the transfer port design now in the cylinder. Hardly any volume. And that's one of the reasons why these saws run well. They have a metal flywheels, which weighs a little bit more than the plastic flywheel. So once you get that saw spinning, it has some pretty good power, actually. Kind of well pleased with the way they turned out. So we kind of covered a lot of information. I'm not sure if I forgot anything at this point, because like I said, we're kind of struggling in the CRS department, but we kind of covered the 1 series big kid saws from Stihl. Hope you enjoyed this session, and I hope you have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.